All right, welcome back, everybody. There's an overflow room? Okay, I think we're good. I was just told that if you can't find a seat in here, we do have an overflow room set up outside. So go ask the folks at the front desk, they'll point you there. But I think we're good. It's snug in here, but we're doing all right. Excited now that we're back to be announcing the release of a new report from the Better Identity Coalition called Better Identity at 5 Years. It's a report card and updated blueprint for policymakers. As background for those who don't know much about the Better Identity Coalition, we were launched in 2018 as an initiative of the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. Our focus is on bringing together leading companies from different sectors to develop consensus cross-sector policy solutions that can promote the development and adoption of better solutions for identity verification and authentication. Our members are an interesting group. We were launched in early 2018, largely driven by companies that I would say are on the buy side of identity. Think about companies in banks, payments, fintechs, healthcare, tech and telecom, who basically depend on reliable identity verification and authentication solutions to be able to run their business. And so we have largely focused on trying to come at this issue from, what do these companies need? And more, generally, what does the country need, since they represent a good cross-section of the economy? We also have a lot of the vendors as well and the solution providers. We're certainly not totally exclusive on that side, but it's really a nice mix of companies that provide a great perspective on this topic. So setting the stage, identity is a term, obviously, a lot of you here get it, but for those who might be newbies, it's a term that gets thrown around a lot. It means a lot of different things. And this is an oversimplification of it all, but we're generally talking about two things with identity. One is what I would call the challenges around identity proofing. It's relevant to the account opening, determining if you come in and basically say, hey, I'm Jane Smith, does a Jane Smith really exist? There might be 37,000 Jane Smiths in the US. Which one are you? This is where identifiers like the social security number are very helpful. And are you a particular Jane Smith? That's one of the hardest things to find at all. And then after we do account opening, we then get onto the authentication conundrum, which is really the password problem. When you're logging back in and you basically need to prove that you're the same person that a credential or an account was originally issued to. Most of our challenges today are trying to solve one of these two issues, identity proofing or authentication. So in 2018, the Better Identity Coalition released a policy blueprint, laying out 5 core areas where government can and should help to address issues in digital identity. With this, we had a specific action plan underneath the 5 core areas that basically said who needs to do what in both Congress and the executive branch. At the core of this blueprint was the idea there's no silver bullet here. There isn't any single action or initiative that's going to solve identity. But taken as a package, if this policy blueprint's enacted and funded, it'll make identity better. And our key initiatives were these 5. How do we prioritize the development of next-gen remote ID proofing and verification systems? How do we start to rethink the way we use the social security number? One of the things we pointed out is that it's not one thing, it's two. It's both an identifier. Caitlin Clark was talking about her challenges being confused with the basketball player. There's a Jeremy Grant who plays for the Portland Trailblazers who spells his name wrong, but is 6'8" and has a much sweeter three-point shot than I do. It's who I need to be in my next life. The SSN is really helpful as an identifier so that if I'm applying, say, to a bank for a credit card, they can quickly figure out, okay, which of these Jeremys is it? We talked about promoting and prioritizing the use of strong authentication, getting away from things like SSNs and passwords and to stronger things and hopefully multiple layers of authentication. We called on the government to look globally and pursue international coordination and harmonization. And we talked about the need to educate consumers and businesses about better identity. With remote identity proofing, that first initiative, we really laid out a core idea that kind of changed the discussion, we think, in this town a little bit, and that so much of this has always gotten back to what I thought have been kind of tired discussions around older approaches like national ID cards. And we proposed a bit of a different idea, which is that we already have a number of different identity credentials today. If any of us have gone through a process of having an agency vet our identity, well, could we ask them to then vouch for us when we're trying to prove who we are online for another transaction? And so we called for America's legacy paper-based systems to be modernized around a privacy-protecting, consumer-centric model that would allow any of us to ask an agency that issued us a credential to stand behind it in the online world by validating the information from that credential. So the blueprints had a notable impact. For starters, I think it's helped to really change the discussion in this town on digital identity. It's driven a number of new policy initiatives. just gotten people thinking about this in some new and fresh ways. The blueprint led to the introduction of a bipartisan bill that's cleared key House and Senate committees the last couple of years, the Improving Digital Identity Act. The standards related portion of that original bill was peeled off and inserted into the CHIPS and Science Act that passed about a year and a half ago as part of a broader NIST authorization. And the coalition has really emerged, we think, as the place where a lot of different people in government come for ideas and collaboration on issues around digital identity. So today, we're really excited to release Better Identity at 5 years, an updated blueprint for policymakers, taking into account that there's some things that have changed over the last few years. Some parts of the blueprint have been enacted. The environment in terms of threats and new attacks has definitely shifted. We have a report card that grades the government on each of the 5 original initiatives, as well as the action items underneath it. We have a new updated 21-point action plan for the federal government to address critical deficiencies in identity infrastructure. As with the original blueprint, there's no silver bullet here. There's a reason there's 21 initiatives and not just one. But our message today is the same as it was back in 2018, which is that if you take this as a package, if this policy blueprint is enacted and funded by government, it's going to address some very critical challenges in digital identity. And as the name of our coalition would suggest, make things better. So, lost my clicker. There we go, report card. How are we doing? How well has the government done? Well, I'm going to start with a very sad grade. So on the first initiative, prioritizing the development of better remote identity proofing systems, we're sadly giving the government a D. We've seen 2 successive administrations effectively ignore this issue. I think the closest we came to either one clearing it a priority was in March of last year when the White House put out their national cybersecurity strategy. There was a great section, section 4.5 on digital identity. But then when the implementation plan came out in July, it skipped over it, just moving from 4.4 to 4.6 as if it was never in there to begin with. And the message has been, this may yet come back, but for the time being, there's no action right now. Congress also has a role here. They failed to pass the Improving Digital Identity Act, which could have forced action in the executive branch. So this is not pointing fingers at any one part of government, but as a whole, in terms of the grade that we're giving. There's a lot of current federal efforts that are underway trying to solve remote identity proofing, but they're focused only on single use cases. How do we do this for government benefit programs? How do we do this for age verification for access to adult materials? All important things, but nobody's really looking more strategically at the fact that we have shortcomings, deficiencies in our overarching digital identity infrastructure. And nobody's focusing on how we can actually enable cross-sector solutions that could work across all of those. With this, we don't really have a strategy or vision of what good looks like as we're moving forward on different fronts in digital identity, or how we get there, or what bad would look like and how we, take some proactive steps on the policy side to avoid those bad outcomes. One of the things that we proposed in the original blueprint was a grant program, $1 billion spread out over 5 years, $200 million a year to states, to really help jumpstart action in terms of migrating legacy systems to support digital identity and attribute validation services. And the message, certainly on the Hill was, well, we understand resources are needed, but $1 billion, where's that going to come from? That's not realistic. One of the things that we have in our new blueprint is an analysis of where we actually have been spending money. And the answer is more than $1 billion has been spent over the last 5 years on addressing some of the sector-specific ID proofing challenges that we think could have been better spent on multi-use infrastructure. So the dollars are there. They're just not necessarily being spent as wisely as they could be. Now, on the bright side, and this is what this makes us at least a D and not an F, is there's some great work underway in a number of agencies, NIST, DHS S&T. We heard from Arun before, who of course was not here from DHS S&T, but they're doing awesome work over there. Jason Lim and his team at the TSA are starting to put some foundational elements in place in terms of standards and some work around things like early mobile driver's license apps that can support better identity solutions. So there's some bright spots, but there's just not enough. I'd say, far too few of them. Congress, as I mentioned, also directed NIST to launch important work with the CHIPS and Science Act. And, that is something that we want to give credit for, at least as a solid base hit. But overall, we think the picture is pretty dismal here. And a lot more work needs to be launched, starting with declaring this to be a national priority. Now, shifting to, why has this been so hard to solve? One of the things we talk about in the blueprint is this concept of the identity gap, which is that the US actually has a number of nationally recognized authoritative identity systems, be it the birth certificate I got from the county in Michigan I was born, the driver's license at the state level. The feds give me a social security number, a passport, a global entry card. These all work if I'm walking across the street to the bank or over to a government office or trying to get a beer at a bar to prove age. But none of these translate well into the online world. And so closing this gap between physical and digital, this is really where we think there needs to be a coordinated effort. And as I mentioned before, there's a handful of states that have started to roll out mobile driver's licenses, working largely in partnership with TSA. But the focus there is almost entirely on in-person use cases, getting through that TSA checkpoint, buying a beer. Those are things that are nice to have. I mean, it would be nice if I didn't have to carry a plastic card in my wallet. But in contrast, where we have this need online, where we've seen documented hundreds of billions of dollars in identity-related crime tied to this identity gap, those use cases aren't being prioritized. And rather than the US, really pushing this forward, the answer seems to be we're going to wait for ISO, the International Standards Organization, to get this figured out. And I think part of our message is we can't afford to wait. And the numbers I think we saw this morning from our friends at ITRC should make that very clear. And there isn't any strategy or activity to try and coordinate other digital counterparts to credentials like birth certificates or passports. So again, some progress. I want to praise it where it's happening, but overall we've got a lot more work to do. And this is becoming a big issue from a cybersecurity perspective. Going back to a House Energy and Commerce Committee hearing in 2017 after a major data breach, Greg Walden, who was the chairman at the time, said, look, we got to stop looking at these breaches in isolation. Not to say that they don't have their own policy issues, but what we're seeing is malicious actors will now combine multiple stolen data sets into one, which then allows them to obtain more complete packages of identity information that they can go to perpetrate the next crime. And certainly if you see this is a visualization from a site called Information is Beautiful on the world's biggest data breaches, where we were at the bottom in 2014 versus where we are now, more breaches, and the bigger the ball, the more records were stolen. This is a trend that basically continues to get worse every year. And as ITRC just said, this past year was the worst ever. So shifting back to the report card, on our second initiative, we gave the SSA a B, and not the SSA, the country, I would say, the government a B for changing the way that we use the social security number. I think policymakers now understand, perhaps in a way that they didn't 5 years ago, that this number that we all have is both an identifier and an authenticator, and that it's the use as an authenticator that poses the biggest risk. We reiterate again, it's very valuable as an identifier. It plays a key role in society, but we really need to stop using it as an authenticator. Knowing your SSN does not prove it's you. In fact, the Russians, the Chinese, a lot of organized criminal gangs probably have it these days as well. The security value just is not there. We're also seeing the value of government services in terms of what SSA can actually do in validating information that's authoritative in their databases. So SSA stood up, we've worked closely with them on this, the ECBSV system, electronic consent-based social security number verification system. It's basically there as a way that if you're applying for a credit account, with your consent, the banks can ping SSA and see if your name and date of birth and SSN actually match. This has been a great tool in helping to start to prevent synthetic identity fraud. It's also helped, what we heard from a lot of our financial services members, is it's providing a bit of a lift right now in new credit applications. Because if I'm a 19-year-old and I'm applying for credit and the report comes back from a credit bureau, oh, we've never seen this person before, maybe it's synthetic, but you get that strong signal from the SSA that it actually matches. That's lifting 3 to 5% of credit applications in certain populations, which is a great story. But it's not the greatest system. SSA is only doing this for a subset of financial services. They're not providing it to other sectors where this would be helpful, government benefits included, where we've also seen a lot of synthetic identity fraud. There's additional functionality that's really needed in the system to make it more effective for financial institutions. And there's some challenges with the pricing model SSA has set up that we're starting to see the service falter. So this is where we gave a B, but there's still some more work to be done. Here's the best grade the government gets. Our third objective, promoting and prioritizing the use of strong authentication. We've seen great leadership, particularly in the Biden-Harris administration, from the White House and from CISA, leading robust efforts to promote MFA adoption nationally. They've also been leaning forward to point out the MFA that you might have used 5 years ago might not stand up to current attacks, like more sophisticated phishing attacks. So we really need to get to phishing-resistant MFA, whether it be FIDO or PKI or other solutions that can stand up to a lot of the attacks that are compromising legacy MFA. And so we've seen the More Than a Password campaign from CISA. We'll have Eric Goldstein from CISA doing our closing keynote today and talking about that. But great job all around here. On the international coordination and harmonization side, we gave a B minus. So there's been some good things that have happened. I want to call out upfront the work the Treasury Department did in leading an effort to create robust digital identity guidance in the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF. Ann Walworks, who's here from Treasury. You can stand up and take a bow if you want, but I don't want to embarrass you. Maybe I just did. The FATA, for those who don't know, it's a global standards-making body of financial regulators that are tasked with making sure individual country financial systems aren't used for bad things like money laundering or terrorist financing. And there's never really been guidance on how to approach the digital identity portion. And this is basically guidance to every financial regulator across the globe that they can focus on and follow, actually have to follow, in order to take a risk-based approach to digital identity. We've also seen our friends at NIST lead efforts in the Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, to coordinate with the European Union on different issues. And there's a G7 paper that highlighted the importance of digital identity in building trust and sharing best practices. Part of the reason we gave a B minus is that at a time when our peers across the globe, be it Europe, the UK, Canada, Australia, Singapore, just to name a few, are all advancing their own robust digital identity initiatives in their countries. The lack of a US strategy here means we're increasingly excluded from conversations. Certainly, if you look at some of the stuff that we've done in the TTC, it's comparing, NIST frameworks for identity against a robust program that's, getting billions of dollars investment in Europe. It's kind of hard to compare the two. And so we're really only able to engage some time around the edges. And at a time where we should be leading globally, instead we're behind. And then finally, educating consumers and businesses about better identity. This is another B minus. So first of all, again, highlighting the A to CISA for their work on the MFA front. Great efforts there. But the lack of any initiative around remote identity proofing, where a lot of the crime and fraud is shifting, means that consumers and businesses don't actually know what they're supposed to do here. It's almost non-existent when it comes to guidance. Likewise, ID theft victims continue to face a really confusing landscape when it comes to knowing how and where to get help. We've heard a little bit of this from our friends at ITRC because that's a big part of the work that we do. So we think there's still a lot more work to do here, even where there's been some good progress. I just wanted to hit in terms of why this is so important. We haven't, we rolled this out back in 2018 and we've updated a lot of these statistics, identity by the numbers. So borrowing from our friends at the ID Theft Resource Center, over 3,200 data compromises reported in 2023, a 78% increase year over year, 72% higher than they've ever seen before, and impacting over 350 million individuals. By the way, the population of the US is only about 330 million, which means some people are being impacted 2, 3, 4 times or more in these incidences. And more than 80% of confirmed breaches year after year are tied to identity, often compromised credentials. $212 billion, that's the value of transactions reported to FinCEN by banks in the suspicious activity reports they filed, tied to failures in the ID verification process. We'll be hearing from FinCEN's director, and as well as a panel of their experts on this a little later today. I mentioned in my opening remarks, shifting over to government benefits, the GAO says between $100 to $135 billion in losses tied to pandemic unemployment insurance fraud, where again, stolen compromised identities were the attack vector. The Federal Reserve says there's about $20 billion a year in losses to banks due to synthetic identity fraud. They call it the fastest growing type of financial crime in the US. 915,000 kids victims of ID fraud in 2022, and a nearly 3,000% increase reported by the Federal Trade Commission in ID theft complaints tied to stolen government benefits in 2020. These are not great numbers. Everything keeps getting worse. We heard this from ITRC today. We heard this from Caitlin Clark at the White House with the projections of cybercrime, with much of it tied to identity. This is a problem. One of the questions that we asked within our members when we started to update this paper a few months ago was, is the blueprint still relevant? And that a lot of things have changed. I mean, for starters, we went through a global pandemic where in-person transactions were just impossible for about a year. We saw our adversaries, sweep in to exploit the chaos there. We're starting to see a lot more sophisticated attacks right now, in many cases powered by generative AI, that it's this whole new threat vector we weren't even thinking about 5 years ago. And as I mentioned before, every one of our peer countries has launched an initiative, and the US stands alone in the fact that we don't have anything here. Our take was, yeah, absolutely, this is still relevant. We think for the issues that have been ignored, the need for action is greater than ever. And for areas where we've made progress, there's obviously more work that needs to be done. But that doesn't mean that our blueprint and the associated action plan from 2018 should stay stagnant. So in this new report, we've updated the action plan to support our key initiatives, to reflect both work done to date, as well as to address new concerns, including the way that the threat landscape has evolved, new things that maybe we weren't thinking about a few years ago. And so going forward, our new 21-point action plan is really a comprehensive set of recommendations for policymakers in the US to help get ahead of digital identity challenges. So I want to take some time now to walk through the revised action plan, and then we'll jump into a panel afterwards, talking about some of the implications of stuff. So on the first one, how do we come up with better, more robust remote ID proofing and verification systems? We're reiterating our call that we made 5 years ago for the White House to take the lead, recognizing that our authoritative identity systems are split between the federal, state, and local level. How can we actually bring all the stakeholders together to come up with a coordinated plan to close the gap between digital and physical credentials? This is something that the White House could do today or tomorrow, could have done it a year ago. Congress also could have directed the administration to do this by passing the Improving Digital Identity Act. There's a lot of policy ideas being kicked around. We think it's time one of them moves forward. With this, we think it's important to direct NIST and DHS to jointly accelerate the development of standards and guidance to states that would let them start to launch applications for mobile driver's licenses that are really able to support these remote identity proofing applications. And we think it's important to have agencies prioritize those digital use cases over the in-person use cases that we talked about before. We're reiterating our call for a new $200 million a year grant program to help states accelerate progress here in transitioning to digital identity providers, and borrowing a line from the original Improving Digital Identity Act that Congressman Foster and Loudermilk and Katko and Langevin introduced. We think 10% of those dollars that go to states should be set aside to support what we call identity inclusion efforts, trying to make sure that, recognizing there's a lot of people who can't get a physical ID today, let alone a digital one. Well, how can we help some of them, in that case, so that as we're advancing digital identity efforts, we're also not leaving behind those who can't easily get a foundational ID today. Fourth, we think it's important for the SSA to open up the ECBSV system to support not just a limited subset of financial use cases, but also government services, demand deposit accounts for background checks, basically any place where you might need the SSA to be able to help vouch for you per that model we laid out before. There's a lot of things that they could be doing to improve the performance of that system, offer added functionality, and also by opening it to more organizations, we could further reduce synthetic identity fraud and also help to change the economic model that is causing some real challenges with SSA because it's all fee and reimbursable by industry right now. That's our fifth item, is that we think there needs to be an effort to extend the amount of time that SSA takes to recover the costs that they spent, or the dollars that they spent building ECBSV. They had some massive cost overruns, millions of dollars that those costs sort of now are owned by industry because Congress said that the program has to be reimbursable. Industry is willing to pay for them, but they're trying to compress the recovery period to a point that it's jacking up prices. And we're seeing industry use of the tool go down. And that's not a positive direction for anybody other than fraudsters. We think we should also look to mirror the ECBSV model at other agencies that have information on people, be it IRS, be it the State Department with passports. The Postal Service delivers mail to your house every day. They definitely know where you live, but there's not an easy way for commercial entities to validate address with them. We'd like to see the State Department follow what we're seeing in some DMVs and offer people the option of getting a mobile passport app, and that they could store securely in their smartphone. We want to make sure that these, again, the use cases are prioritized not for in-person use cases, but for digital online remote identity proofing. With this, we'd love to see Congress pass the Post ID Act. This was a great bill that Senators Cassidy and Wyden introduced late last year. That basically, sort of pointed to the fact that we lean on the post office today for identity proofing for the passport. And to the extent you need a fallback for when truly remote options don't work, well, the post office is a place, most Americans live within 10 miles of one, that you could use as a fallback for in-person identity proofing. So this would just authorize the Postal Service to start offering these services. And we'd love to see that going forward, because I think there's a lot of different sectors that could make use of this as a fallback. Think about a digital-only bank who can't figure out who's who online, but you could say, if you want to open an account, here's an option for you. Ninth, we were reiterating the call that we had a few years ago for Treasury and the financial regulators to establish a task force to see what government can do from the policy side to drive the adoption of more resilient digital identity solutions in financial services. Shifting to NIST, this is a new recommendation. You know, we talked a little bit in the earlier panel about controversy around biometrics and concerns around bias and whether some solutions are inequitable. NIST does a lot of great research here right now on hundreds of algorithms. The problem is what they publish is thousands of pages long collectively, and it's a little hard sometimes for anybody who's deploying to actually know, hey, you tested 350 algorithms. Could you tell us like the top 20 in terms of both accuracy and equity? And so we really think that, you know, a quick summary of this that NIST would publish to say, look, these are the ones that actually met a high threshold. And then you could have a policy, be it a law or, you know, an OMB policy memo that would tell agencies only use those ones. And then when we see these horror stories in the news of people that are using a second or third tier algorithm in government, well, this would be a way to prevent it. It's a way to basically take great research that's already been done today and make it more digestible and then back it up by policy to ensure that we're only using best-in-class biometric solutions. With this, we think, you know, talking again about what we heard on the last panel, a lot of challenges these days with biometrics and liveness detection. How do you really know that you're seeing a live person on the other end? And NIST is doing some good work here. We just love to see them accelerated to develop more robust guidance and criteria for liveness detection and biometrics with an idea, with an eye toward helping defenders stay ahead of some of the attacks we're starting to see creep into the ecosystem with deepfakes. We'd love to see the government develop a new forward-looking investment strategy for R&D and identity. And with deepfakes starting to occur, we'd love to see a multi-agency task force, you know, perhaps looking at the law enforcement side, where you've got a lot of different agencies tracking different financial crime. Can we have a task force set up that can monitor and combat emerging scalable threats to identity systems that they're seeing from deepfakes and other AI-generated attacks? We think this is going to be an important issue in the years ahead. A note on AI, I'll say we touched on this a little bit earlier. I think there's a lot of people who are looking at the threat from AI based on what we have seen over the last year. Well, remember what we've seen over the last year was something we hadn't seen 2 years before that. The technology is not just stopping where it is. Innovation's happening very, very quickly. And so we really think it's important to be thinking 3 years out, 5 years out, 10, 20 years out in terms of where this is going and thinking about how we need to harden some of our defenses to actually be able to account for where things are happening. So 13 items, that's most of them, well, the majority at least in the first initiative. I keep clicking, but I'm not getting advancement. There we go. On the SSN front, reiterating the call from the original policy blueprint, let's stop using the SSN as an authenticator, migrate to alternative solutions that are better for authentication. One of the things we've suggested to lead the way is an executive order that would actually specifically ban an agency for using the SSN for any authentication purpose, but still preserving its use as an identifier. I don't think a lot of agencies are doing it, but there probably are some that might be using it in the authentication side. And this would be a way to send a message that we need to move toward more forward-looking solutions. And then with this, we also think one of the issues we've run into, and we discovered in the original blueprint when we talk about overuse of the SSN, is a lot of times when you ask companies, you know, you have a breach, they'll lose 30 million social security numbers. Why were you storing them? Well, the government told us we had to. There's a lot of laws and regulations that actually mandate that SSNs are collected and stored. Some of them actually make a ton of sense. I mean, certainly, look, I'm applying for a credit card. The bank needs to know that I'm not the 6'8" power forward Jeremy Grant, and the SSN is, aside from some other obvious deficiencies on my side, an easy way to figure that out. But there's other things that we discovered in that inventory we did a few years ago that didn't necessarily make sense. It at least, you know, would be good to review them and see if they're all still relevant. Prioritize and promote the use of strong authentication. So here, getting back to the aid we gave government, the White House put out OMB Memo 2209 about 2 years ago that requires all agencies only use phishing-resistant authentication in enterprise application, and that it's an option in the public-facing side. And with policies focused in the private sector, my numbers are off here now, they're not all number one. You know, we think the government really needs to focus on enforcing the memo. And then on the private sector, one of the trends that we have been seeing is less with traditional authentication and more with new laws that might restrict the use of data for what I would call risk-based authentication tools, particularly when we're dealing with security and fraud analytics. We saw this in California where they advanced a bill this last year to amend the California Consumer Privacy Protection Act to basically come up with a one-click button that you can just delete all of your data. which sounds really nice if you don't want different companies, different data brokers having it. But there wasn't really a clear exception for being able to use that data to fuel some of the security tools that stop fraud, that give additional context on authentication. And so, we are definitely not fighting to try and avoid these restrictions on data more generally. That's not our fight. But our main point is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot of constructive applications here, and we can put some walls around secure, appropriate use of data for security and fraud prevention that needs to be preserved. And so we are worried as we see some of these copycat laws get proposed in other states or potentially at the federal level that we end up essentially kneecapping security professionals from, being able to get, some of the most important tools that they need to guard against identity-related crime. We also want to see CISA continue to promote their More Than a Password campaign, as we talked about before. On the international side, a couple things. One, I mentioned the EU is moving forward with a really robust initiative to create digital identity wallets for everybody in Europe. Here, we'd love to see NIST and DHS and Treasury actively engage with their European counterparts to identify opportunities for collaboration and interoperability, and also share lessons learned and best practices. There's a little bit of work underway there with the work in the TTC, but we think we need to do more to build off of it. And then second, just in general, we'd love to see the government have more resources to engage more broadly in identity standards work across the globe. NIST and DHS are engaged right now in a number of different digital standards bodies, but honestly, I see our presence being limited by resource and budget headcount constraints. Properly funding these efforts would allow us to be better represented along our peer countries on the global stage, and again, a way that the US can be more of a leader here in driving things. And then on the education side, two items. One, we think CISA should build off the work it's doing on MFA to also educate consumers on best practices around remote ID proofing, identity protection, provide support to some private sector organizations that help with this education. We also would love to see, we've talked with ITRC about this, the idea of, can we come up with a one-stop shop that an agency like the FTC or CFPB could drive, or perhaps jointly, that would better support identity crime victims? Because there's a big problem today that if you're a victim, you might not know what to do. Do I call my local police? Do I call the FBI? Are there nonprofits that can help me recover? Are there governments that can help me recover? And so the idea of coming up with a one-stop shop would let victims access services a lot more easily. And so we think this is an idea that's worth pursuing going forward. So in summary, America faces a clear choice. We can sit back and fail to modernize our identity solutions. We're going to continue to see identity-related breaches and cybercrime get worse. The legacy tools are going to fail as the attackers keep advancing. And this is all going to be creating additional barriers to the availability of services online and erode trust in digital commerce. Or we can actually take a proactive approach and say we're going to get ahead of this identity conundrum. A step that'll position America to address security challenges, usability challenges, privacy challenges, and enable the digital economy to thrive. So our new revised blueprint has a set of clear policy initiatives that are both significant in impact and we think very achievable if the government chooses to act on them. And that's been a big if that is hanging out there. But we think we can make real progress in the next 2 to 3 years. And so we're calling on the administration, Congress, and state governments to each move to advance initiatives that are outlined in this blueprint with an eye toward an ecosystem where identity can be what I've liked to call for years the great enabler, delivering trusted service delivery online in a way that's not only good for security, but also enhances privacy, inclusion, convenience, and innovation. So with that, I'm happy to take a couple questions before our next panel. Any questions? John, all the way in back.
Thanks for the presentation and great report. You mentioned a one-stop shop at FTC for supporting identity fraud victims. Does identitytheft.gov not do the job? And if it's not doing the job, what should the commission do to help it do the job?
I would actually love you to hand the microphone to Eva next to you. I think she's got more thoughts on that.
Actually, we were just having that conversation. I think they need more help. They need to bring in more partners to help fill the gaps. Biggest example is the FTC affidavit that was designed to make reporting a one-stop shop for victims. It's wonderful in theory. I think we need more effort there, but it's not working. Practically speaking, it's not working. Most victims still need to go get a police report because the entities where they have to go to report and work through the crime won't accept the FTC affidavit. In fact, a lot of other government agencies do not accept the FTC affidavit as proof that you are an identity crime victim. The states for unemployment don't accept it. Victims need a police report. So I think FTC is a great place to start the process. And we partner with them, we receive referrals from them, but there are gaps and we need to bring in other organizations like the ITRC, of course you knew I was going to say that, to fill those gaps.
Thanks. Eva, why don't you come up here now since you're on the next panel? If I can ask you and Pam and Carol and Ben to all join us up here. Get mic'd up. Happy to take one more question while everybody's coming up and getting settled if there is one. All right, if not, I will let them all get settled.